Have you ever sensed that something in your life was unraveling long before you had proof, before words, before evidence, just a quiet knowing you kept pushing aside? I didn't recognize it as betrayal at first. I called it distance. Fatigue. Marriage settling into its natural shape. Mark and I had been together for 5 years, long enough for habits to replace excitement and silence to masquerade as peace. From the outside, we looked solid. From the inside, I felt like I was slowly disappearing. The strange part was that the first sign something was wrong didn't come from Mark. It came from my dog. Bruno had entered our lives almost by accident, a rescue with wary eyes and an unshakable instinct for closeness. From the moment he came home, he attached himself to me with a devotion that felt almost human. He followed me from room to room, slept at my feet, watched me with an attentiveness that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. Mark noticed, of course. He joked about it at first. "Guess I've been replaced," he said once, smiling without humor. But over time, the joke hardened into irritation. Bruno wasn't just affectionate, he was observant. Too observant. Whenever Mark came home late, Bruno stiffened. When Mark's phone buzzed at odd hours, Bruno lifted his head, alert and watchful. Once, when Mark kissed my cheek distractedly and turned away, Bruno let out a low sound that didn't quite register as a growl but stayed with me long after. I told myself it was nothing. Dogs react to energy, I reasoned. And Mark was stressed. Everyone said marriages went through phases like this, periods where love became quieter, less demanding. I had learned to accept that explanation because questioning it felt dangerous. Still, late at night, lying beside Mark's turned back, I found myself watching the rise and fall of his shoulders, wondering when we had stopped facing each other. Bruno would curl closer then, a steady presence, grounding me in a reality I wasn't ready to face. Looking back, I understand now, the conflict had already begun. I just hadn't named it yet. Something in my life was demanding honesty about love, loyalty, and the cost of ignoring what my heart already knew. And once the truth began to surface, there was no putting it back. Mark and I hadn't always been like this. There was a time when his laughter filled rooms and his attention felt effortless, when I believed love meant choosing the same person every day without question. We met in college, bonded over shared routines and sensible dreams, and mistook compatibility for depth. When he proposed, I said yes because it felt like the logical next step and because I loved him in the way you love something familiar and safe. The first few years of marriage passed quietly. Not unhappily, but not vividly either. We settled into roles without discussing them. Mark became absorbed in his work, often bringing home the weight of it like an invisible coat he refused to take off. I learned to ask fewer questions, to fill silences with practicality. Somewhere along the way, emotional honesty became an inconvenience we both avoided. Bruno arrived during that fragile equilibrium. I had suggested getting a dog impulsively, hoping, though I didn't admit it, that caring for something together might reconnect us. Mark agreed with a shrug. "If you want," he said, already halfway elsewhere. From the beginning, Bruno disrupted the balance we'd been pretending was stable. He demanded attention, routine, presence. He needed to be walked, fed, comforted. I rose to the responsibility eagerly. Mark participated minimally, as if the dog were a temporary guest rather than a living commitment. What unsettled me wasn't Mark's detachment, it was Bruno's reactions. He seemed to sense shifts before I did. When Mark grew distant, Bruno grew vigilant. When Mark spoke absent-mindedly about work dinners or late meetings, Bruno's body tensed, his gaze fixed, as though listening beneath the words. I began to notice patterns I'd once dismissed. Mark guarded his phone now, angling the screen away. He laughed more, just not with me. When I asked how his day had been, his answers were clipped, rehearsed. "Same as always," he'd say, even when his restlessness suggested otherwise. One evening, as we sat across from each other in silence, I realized something had changed fundamentally. It wasn't just that Mark felt far away. It was that I no longer recognized the space between us as normal. Bruno lay at my feet, alert but calm, as if anchoring me. That night, I understood the stakes for the first time. This wasn't about a rough patch or fading romance. It was about truth, whether I would continue choosing comfort over clarity, or finally confront what my instincts, echoed by a loyal dog, were trying to tell me. The answer hovered just out of reach, waiting for me to stop looking away. The distance between Mark and me stopped feeling accidental and began to feel engineered. It showed up in small, precise ways. He started coming home later without explanation, offering vague smiles instead of details. His phone never left his hand, and when it buzzed, his attention sharpened in a way it no longer did for me. I noticed how quickly he stepped outside to take calls, how conversations ended the moment I entered a room. Bruno noticed too. He waited by the door long after Mark should have been home, ears tilted toward the driveway. When Mark finally arrived, Bruno didn't rush forward anymore. He stood still, assessing, as if measuring something invisible. Once, when Mark reached down to pet him, Bruno backed away, subtle, deliberate. Mark laughed it off, but the sound landed hollow. "You're imagining things," Mark told me one night when I finally spoke up. "You've been anxious lately." The word stung. Anxious. As if awareness were a flaw. "I just want to feel close to you again," I said. He sighed, rubbing his temples. "You're making this bigger than it is." But it was already big. It filled the house with a tension that made even ordinary moments feel strained. Dinners were quieter. Our bed felt wider. When Mark touched me, it felt obligatory, his mind elsewhere. One evening, while folding laundry, I found myself pausing over one of his shirts. It smelled unfamiliar, not unpleasant, just wrong. I stood there longer than necessary, my chest tight, listening to Bruno's slow breathing behind me. I wanted to confront Mark. I also wanted to be wrong. The conflict wasn't just between us anymore, it was inside me. Part of me clung to the version of our marriage that felt safe, predictable. Another part, newly awake, was counting inconsistencies, connecting dots I'd once ignored. Bruno seemed to side with that second part, staying close, steady, unyielding. The breaking point came quietly. Mark mentioned a work dinner one Thursday, already reaching for his keys. He didn't meet my eyes. Bruno stood between us, unmoving. "Do you have to go?" I asked. Mark hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah. It's important." After the door closed, the house fell silent. Bruno let out a low whine and pressed his head against my leg. I rested my hand on his back, feeling the truth settle heavier than fear. Something was unfolding whether I was ready or not. The tension had reached its limit, and I knew the next step, whatever it was, would change everything. The truth arrived without ceremony, slipping into my life the way doubt always does, quietly, insistently. 2 nights after that so-called work dinner, Mark left his tablet on the kitchen counter. It was an ordinary oversight, the kind that would have meant nothing weeks earlier. I wasn't looking for anything. I told myself that even as I picked it up, even as Bruno settled at my feet, watchful and still, a notification lit the screen. I recognized the tone instantly, too familiar, too intimate to belong to a colleague. I hesitated, my thumb hovering, my heart already bracing. When I opened the message, the world narrowed to a few lines of text that confirmed what my instincts had been circling for months. "I hate waiting. Last night wasn't long enough." There was no dramatic rush of emotion. No shouting. Just a heavy, sinking clarity. The kind that rearranges your understanding of the past in seconds. Late nights. Guarded phones. The distance I'd been trying to explain away. It all aligned with brutal precision. When Mark came home, I didn't ask questions. I didn't raise my voice. I simply held up the tablet. His shoulders sagged before he spoke. "It didn't mean to happen like this," he said, as if intention were the only measure that mattered. Bruno moved closer to me, placing himself firmly at my side. Mark noticed this time. His eyes flicked downward, then away. "How long?" I asked. Mark exhaled slowly. "A few months." Months. While I had been adjusting myself to silence, convincing myself love required endurance, he had been investing his attention elsewhere. The realization hurt less than the understanding that he had stopped choosing me long before I stopped believing in us. "I didn't want to hurt you," he added. "But you did," I said, surprised by the steadiness of my voice. The conversation ended not with apologies or promises, but with exhaustion. We were two people standing in the aftermath of a truth that had finally surfaced. Mark retreated into the bedroom. I stayed where I was, sinking onto the couch, Bruno's warmth pressed against my leg. In that moment, the central conflict became unmistakable. This wasn't just about infidelity. It was about presence versus avoidance, loyalty versus convenience. About whether I would keep shrinking myself to preserve something already broken. As the house grew quiet, I realized the question was no longer what Mark would do next. It was what I would. The days that followed moved strangely, as if time itself were unsure how to behave now that the truth was out in the open. Mark didn't leave right away. We existed in the same house like cautious strangers, careful not to collide. Conversations were reduced to logistics, work schedules, groceries, who would take Bruno out in the morning. The emotional weight sat between us, unspoken but unmistakable. What surprised me most was how little I wanted explanations. Mark tried, of course. He spoke about feeling unseen, about drifting without realizing how far he'd gone. He framed the affair as something that happened to him rather than something he chose. I listened politely, aware of how detached I felt. Bruno, on the other hand, never left my side. Each night, he curled closer than usual, his steady breathing a reminder that presence didn't require justification. When Mark spoke, Bruno watched him intently, not aggressive, just alert like a quiet witness refusing to forget what had been revealed. One evening, Mark finally asked the question he'd been avoiding. "What do you want to do?" he said. I looked at him then, really looked. At the man I had spent years accommodating, excusing, waiting for. I felt no anger in that moment, only clarity. "I don't know yet," I said honestly. "But I know I won't pretend anymore." That seemed to unsettle him more than any accusation. Pretending had been our shared language. Without it, there was nothing familiar left to stand on. Later that night, alone in the living room, I replayed the last 5 years with uncomfortable precision. How often I'd dismissed my own needs. How quickly I'd learned to interpret absence as normal. The betrayal hurt, but the deeper wound was realizing how long I had collaborated in my own silence. Bruno rested his head on my knee. I stroked the fur behind his ears, grounding myself in the simple reality of the moment. For the first time since the confrontation, I allowed myself to imagine a future that wasn't centered on repair. Not fixing Mark. Not restoring what had been lost. But rebuilding something honest, whatever shape that might take. The marriage wasn't officially over yet. Decisions still waited to be made. But something irreversible had already happened. I had stopped negotiating with the truth. And once that door closed, there was no going back, only forward, into whatever came next. Mark moved out a week later, carrying the remnants of a life we once shared, his clothes, his books, his excuses. The apartment felt simultaneously empty and expansive, as though the walls themselves had been holding their breath until he left. For the first time in years, I could hear the quiet not as absence, but as space for possibility. Bruno trotted beside me across the empty rooms, tail wagging slowly, a steady rhythm that reminded me I wasn't alone. He didn't just offer comfort, he anchored me in reality. Where Mark had failed to notice my unease, Bruno had noticed it instinctively. Where Mark had chosen distraction, Bruno had chosen presence. The contrast was impossible to ignore, and for the first time, I understood just how much I had been missing. That night, I sat on the couch, Bruno curled at my feet, and I let myself cry not just for the betrayal, but for all the years I had ignored my own instincts, for every moment I had silenced the part of me that knew something was wrong. The grief wasn't just for the relationship, it was for the version of myself I had almost lost in the process. And yet, amid the ache, there was clarity. The truth had weight, yes, but it also had freedom. Bruno nudged my hand, demanding attention, reminding me to stay present. His unwavering loyalty contrasted sharply with Mark's absence, and I realized that loyalty, honesty, and presence were the pillars I needed to rebuild my life. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, just the courage to honor my own worth. In the weeks that followed, I began to reclaim space in small ways. I reorganized the apartment, hung pictures I had hidden, opened windows I had kept shut, and let sunlight into rooms that had gone dim. Bruno accompanied me everywhere, a constant reminder that love didn't always need words, apologies, or excuses. It needed recognition, attention, and consistency. Some days, I caught myself glancing at the door, half expecting Mark to return. And some days, I was startled to realize I didn't care. Not because I was indifferent, but because I had learned to trust my instincts and honor my boundaries. I had learned that presence speaks louder than promises, and that fidelity is as much about emotional integrity as physical actions. Bruno had done what Mark couldn't in 5 years. He had made me notice, made me feel, and made me trust myself again. In his quiet way, he had revealed the truth and offered unwavering support. He had reminded me that I was worthy of attention, honesty, and care. I don't know what comes next, and I don't pretend to. The future is still uncertain, and perhaps it always will be. But for the first time in years, I feel steady. I feel awake. And I feel ready to build a life that honors the part of me Bruno never let be ignored.